Tharoor. Last year on the GlobSec Forum in Bratislava, the Foreign Minister Jaishankar said, and the video was followed by hundreds of millions of people across the world. He said that, and it was in May, a few months after the war started, and he said that Europe needs to wake up because Europe really thinks that Europe problems are world's problems, but the world problems are not always Europe problems. Do you agree with this, and do you see this war in Ukraine as a transformational war, or is it a local war in Europe? What is at stake for India and globally?
Well, you know, those remarks certainly were greeted with a lot of approbation, a lot of interest and a lot of approbation in India and in many other countries, simply as a wake-up call, as you rightly implied. But it was interesting that at the start of the Raisina Dialogue this year, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, responded very specifically to that comment, and she said two things that struck home as well. The first was that when the sovereignty of a member state of the United Nations is violated and its borders are crossed over, that's not just Europe's problem. And the second thing she said was that in any case, given the impact of the war on the world, Europe's problems have become the world's problems. And in fact, I was digging up some figures on this, and if you look at the extraordinary consequences for the whole world of this war, they've been truly calamitous. I mean, Russia and Ukraine used to export more than 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley, but 70% of our sunflower oil came from Ukraine, as an Indian. We found that about 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain couldn't get out to other countries. And Ukraine and Russia used to export about 6 million tons of agricultural commodities a month to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. By June of 2022, that number had come down by 4/5. It was a fraction of what it should be. The World Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, estimated that global food prices rose 20% because of the war. And the consequence is that in places in Africa and elsewhere, the malnourished population is going to be rising from between 7.6 to 13.1 million children who will not have enough to eat because of this blessed war that in theory has nothing to do with them. It's on a different continent, but they're the ones who are also going to be suffering. You've seen in our own subcontinent the impact on the economies of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on, of the crisis in fuel prices, commodity prices, all of that. So for us to pretend that all of this is something we can afford to ignore is not an option. The war in Europe has affected the rest of the world, and it's hurt the world in very tangible, measurable, quantifiable ways. Now, I think what Mr. Jaishankar was alluding to was a slightly different aspect, which is that, say, when India's borders were violated with impunity, whether by our friends in the north from China, or whether it was the terrorists coming across the borders from Pakistan, that Europe behaved as if that was India's problem. There was no great solidarity expressed. But when a European border is violated, the expectation seems to be that the rest of the world should be concerned. I think that was his concern. I shouldn't be speaking for him, I'm in the opposition, but I think the point he was trying to make was about double standards. And I think double standards are something we should all be conscious of in this kind of dialogue. But if you were to look, strictly speaking, at the question, the second question as to whether this is just a local war, it is and it isn't. It's local in the literal sense that the damage and destruction is essentially in one place, Ukraine. And perhaps, according to the Russians, now more and more in their country and the side of the border as well. But the rest of the world, if not physically affected, has been affected in all these measurable ways. And the rest of the world also is reeling from the various other economic effects. You have sanctions, the things you can't sell. Those countries that have trade relations with the Russians have had to scramble to find other outlets. Those of us who used to import things that are no longer so easy to import, prices that have gone up, all sorts of essential items. So ultimately, any war that has global consequences cannot be treated as a purely European problem.
Thank you. Let me follow up on what you said, and also following up on yesterday's visit of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who was here and who was speaking. India stance towards the war in Ukraine or the Russian aggression was not very strong and clear, condemning the Russian aggression because of historic ties, economic ties, etc. Do you see this war changing that relationship in a mid or long term? Will it have some kind of impact to your relationships with Russia?
Well, I was the only member of parliament to actually speak against the Indian position in parliament because I felt that we had let down a number of the principles that we've always stood for since independence, especially in our first few statements at the UN. The first 2 or 3 speeches, we didn't mention sovereignty of a member state, we didn't mention the inviolability of borders, we didn't mention the word invasion or the word war, we didn't talk about the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. Now, all of these things are things we have said time and time again on every conflict for the last 75 years, and suddenly we didn't say it, and that I thought was an abandonment of principle. I'm pleased to say that India's position did evolve to the point where these principles are now being advocated regularly by India. Why was India reluctant to take a stand against Russia? I'd say there was some practical politics involved. India's had a long relationship with Russia and before that the Soviet Union, which was a strong backer of India on issues that mattered to us. Kashmir at the Security Council, for example. The Russians often protected us against hostile action by other powers. There's a long series of IOUs there. There's a defense relationship. The Russians are prepared to sell us weaponry that the West was not in the 60s and 70s. And so that weaponry now at one point at peak was 85% of all of India's defense equipment. Now it's come down to about 45% because India has been diversifying. We get arms from Israel, America, France, and so on. But the fact is that 45% is still a lot, and what exists needs to be serviced, needs to be repaired, needs maintenance, needs parts. So you don't suddenly disrupt your relationship with a supplier of all those essential things. There's also, of course, importance in terms of imports of some oil, gas, fertilizers, other commodities. So it's a relationship with some substance that India did not want to lightly dismiss by completely taking a hostile stand. That much I can understand, but I do believe we could have told the Russians where we stood, and it was interesting that finally Prime Minister Modi in Samarkand said directly in front of the world's cameras, "This is not an era for war, Mr. President," which is as clear a message. And as recently as November, Jaishankar, the foreign minister, was in Moscow, and he kept talking about the vital importance of peace and dialogue and so on. So I'd say that India in its own way is pushing for a solution. But when you say, what does this imply? I think that over time there will certainly be some problems for the Russians. The longer this war goes on, its capacity, for example, to be a reliable supplier of defense equipment, spares, and so on, will be degraded. Already, a lot of their military production has been affected by the war. They need to produce things for their own armed forces, whose tanks and artillery and weaponry are being assaulted and bombarded and defeated in many battles with Ukraine. On top of that, you've got the situation where the Russians themselves can't get a lot of essential supplies, semiconductor chips, for example, so essential for manufacturing. With the result that you're in a situation where I'm afraid Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China. And for India, over time, how useful is a friend and partner who is most dependent, or more dependent anyway, on your principal adversary? And China has killed 20 of our soldiers on the borders just 2 years ago. We can't forget that so quickly, 2.5 years ago. So in these circumstances, a Russia that is China dependent, or that looks more and more like a junior partner of China, is much less useful to India than perhaps the Russia that embarked on this war was. So I think there will again be a gradual downgrading of the relationship for that practical reason. Meantime, oil and fertilizer sales are continuing. The Russians offer us a discount. It's about 30%. But a 30% discount on oil that's 60% more expensive because of the war is not such a great deal. And then on top of that, we are looking at some of the diplomatic conversations going on around. I think there's a clear sign that India does not want to be seen as taking sides against Russia, but nor is it in any way conveying support or even condoning the war. It's accepting it as a reality, that it doesn't feel right now it can afford to disapprove. As I said, as an individual member of parliament, I would have had a slightly different point of view.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspectives on how this relationship is evolving. And when we are in China, and it is decreasing focus from the main strategic long-term thing. But what message would we send to China if we, after 1 year back off from Ukraine, what message would it say to any other future aggressors? That's what we can do, actually only 1 year, and then we push the country that was attacked into some kind of compromise? I think it would not be the right message. But I've seen all of you, Rashi, saw that you wanted to react. So please, if you can have last word also, Shashi.
No,
Teresa.
Very quick, I enjoyed that comment on this coalition of three, where nobody trusts the other one. It would be the most weird coalition and most unnatural. But just a quick comment, if this was a distraction from a real problem of China, and if China was able to make Russia to do this lunacy and shoot both of their legs and then complain that they cannot walk, then it would be extremely skilled intelligence or diplomatic operation by China, and I congratulate on that. But truth is that what Russia is doing, it completely doesn't make sense. It's so irrational because it doesn't make them stronger. It makes them much weaker. It makes Europe temporarily weaker, but we will catch up. We will accommodate. And at the beginning, you said, will Europe be stronger after this crisis? Every individual crisis and every large crisis is an opportunity to become stronger. And I trust Europe will come stronger, and it's already all signs. We are coming stronger. Even overall goodwill community, where I include very much India, will become stronger. So at the end, congratulations to this. When Russia is weaker, we will become strong again, but probably the only victories will be China, where the fruit will be lowered down for easier pickup. But I think international community is strong enough to cope with this challenge. We learned the lesson of strategic dependencies, and we will continue in that, also in relation to China, it's clear.
Thank you, Shashi.
Well, I mean, you remember Napoleon's crack, or was it Voltaire's, about the Holy Roman Empire? There was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Chinese peace plan not much of a plan. There's no real prospects of peace in it, and I wonder how Chinese it is, because it really seems to be full of platitudes that could have been prepared in Moscow. So objectively, there is a case for peace. India has also been trying to make one. But I'm not quite sure if China is going to be a credible agent for it, especially the way it's behaved in the course of the war. But also, frankly, I'm not sure either side at the moment is ready for peace. They both seem to think they can, quote-unquote, win whatever winning is all about. And at this stage, it's far from clear that we are going to see a swift end to this nasty conflict. If anything, the worry is that it's going to be prolonged and even more of a stalemate, with these continuing consequences for the rest of the world. So it's with each passing month, it's going to be more urgent for all of us to see this come to an end. But in the meantime, it suits some people's interests to have it continue. I'm sure the arms merchants are singing all the way to the bank, and we've certainly seen some people in Russia doing rather well out of all of this, and we're seeing in some other countries. I mean, I must admit that India is refining a bit of the Russian oil and selling it off to UK and US, and you have to ask yourself, what does that imply? So I think rather than getting adjusted to the new normal, we do need peace, but I don't think the Chinese way is the way forward.
Yeah. There is a last word if you want.